marry that woman, Dad. I'm against this marriage. I'll tell everyone what she does to me.
If anyone here is against this marriage, speak now or forever hold your peace. The priest barely finished the sentence when the entire ballroom at the Plaza Hotel in Manhattan took a collective gasp. "I'm against it!" screamed Benjamin Carter, only 8 years old, right there in the middle of the altar, his face red as a tomato and his iPhone clutched tight in his trembling hand. Everyone froze. But what happened next wasn't just some kid throwing a tantrum at his daddy's wedding. This was a full-blown earthquake that shook one of the wealthiest families on the East Coast, right there in front of senators, CEOs, and old money from Connecticut to the Hamptons. Richard Carter, the tech billionaire who'd made his fortune in Silicon Valley before moving his empire to Manhattan, stood there in his custom Tom Ford tuxedo, looking like someone had just told him his stock portfolio crashed. His bride, Camilla Westbrook, a former Miss Georgia with that Southern Belle charm that fooled everyone from Park Avenue to Wall Street, went pale under all that expensive makeup. The kid wasn't backing down. And suddenly, that fancy wedding with the imported orchids and the live string quartet felt more like an episode of Judge Judy than a fairy tale. Benjamin's voice cracked, but he pushed through. "Dad, she locks me in the basement when you're on your business trips to San Francisco. She tells me Mom was trash and that I should have died with her in that car accident on the 405. The room exploded. Women in their Chanel dresses gasped so loud you could hear it echo off the crystal chandeliers. Men in their Brooks Brothers suits pulled out their phones faster than you could say viral video. This wasn't just gossip for the country club anymore. This was front-page New York Times material, CNN breaking news, the kind of scandal that makes your neighbors in Westchester talk for years. Richard's business partner, Tom Davidson, a guy who flew in from Palo Alto just for this disaster, actually stood up and shouted, "What in God's name is going on here?" Camilla's perfectly rehearsed smile, the one she'd practiced in front of every mirror from her mama's house in Savannah to the penthouse on Fifth Avenue, crumbled like a sandcastle at Myrtle Beach. Her mother, Patricia Westbrook, a former beauty queen, who'd spent 30 years climbing the social ladder in Charleston, tried to bolt for the exit, but got blocked by security. The fairy tale was over, the mask ripped clean off, and what everyone saw underneath was uglier than a roach-infested apartment in the Bronx. This wasn't just about a cancelled wedding. This was about a child who'd been tortured, silenced, and broken while the world celebrated a lie built on designer clothes and country club memberships. If you think that's intense, buckle up, because what Benjamin's about to reveal is gonna make you question everything you thought you knew about wealth, power, and what it really takes for a kid to stand up against pure evil in a world that values appearances over truth. Right now, hit that subscribe button for Journeys of Redemption, smash that like, share this video with everyone you know, your book club, your church group, your poker buddies, and drop a comment telling me what city and state you're watching from, because I need to know how far across America this story's reaching, from Seattle to Miami, from Boston to Houston. Benjamin Carter didn't just stop a wedding that day in New York City. He started a war that would expose secrets dirtier than a politician's campaign fund, destroy reputations faster than a stock market crash, and prove that sometimes the smallest voice in the room is the one that changes everything. And trust me, the bombshells about to drop will leave you absolutely speechless, so don't you dare click away. While the guests were still trying to process what they'd just heard, Benjamin stood there in his little Ralph Lauren suit, the one Camilla had forced him to wear that morning while threatening him in the dressing room of the St. Regis Hotel. His hands were shaking so bad, the iPhone nearly slipped, but he gripped it tighter, like it was the only weapon he had against a world that had ignored his pain for 2 solid years. Richard Carter, the man who'd built a tech empire worth $3 billion, the guy who'd been featured on the cover of Forbes and Fortune, stood frozen like a deer in headlights on Interstate 95. He couldn't move, couldn't speak, couldn't do anything but stare at his son with a mix of confusion and dawning horror. The orchestra, a group of Juilliard graduates who'd been paid 10 grand to play at this wedding, didn't know whether to keep playing or pack up and leave. The whole scene felt like one of those old Twilight Zone episodes, where everything looks perfect on the surface, but something's terribly, horribly wrong underneath. Camilla tried to recover, flashing that beauty pageant smile she'd perfected back in Georgia, the one that had won her Miss Peach State in 2015. "Y'all kids say the darndest things, don't they?" she drawled, trying to laugh it off like it was nothing more than a child's imagination running wild. But her voice cracked just enough that everyone noticed. Her mama, Patricia, sitting in the front row in her Oscar de la Renta dress, clutched her pearls. Literally clutched her pearls like she was in some Tennessee Williams play, and whispered loud enough for half the room to hear, "This is just wedding day jitters, everyone calm down." But nobody was calming down. The guests from Greenwich, the ones who summered in Martha's Vineyard and wintered in Palm Beach, were already texting their friends. The Wall Street guys were calculating how this would affect Richard's stock prices. And the society ladies who'd fought for invitations to this wedding were mentally rewriting the story they'd tell at their next charity luncheon at the Metropolitan Club. Benjamin took a deep breath, the kind you take before jumping off the high dive at the community pool, and pressed play on his phone. The audio crackled through the ballroom's sound system, and suddenly Camilla's voice, cold, venomous, nothing like the sweet Southern Belle act, filled the room like poison gas. "Shut your mouth, you little brat, or I'll lock you in that basement again, and this time I won't let you out till morning." "I'd." The collective gasp was so loud, it sounded like a wave crashing on the Jersey shore. Women covered their mouths, men's jaws dropped, and even the waitstaff from the catering company stopped what they were doing to listen. This wasn't some edited TikTok video or fake news from Facebook. This was real, raw, and recorded in high definition on an iPhone 14. The timestamp showed it was from last Tuesday, right around dinner time, when Richard had been in a board meeting in Midtown, and Camilla thought she had the penthouse all to herself. Richard felt his knees buckle. He grabbed the altar to steady himself, his mind racing back through the last 2 years since he'd met Camilla at a charity gala in the Hamptons. He'd been lonely after his wife Sarah died in that terrible car crash on the 405 in Los Angeles 3 years ago, and Camilla had seemed like a godsend, beautiful, charming, great with kids, or so he thought. She'd swept into his life like something out of a romance novel, all sweet tea and southern hospitality, talking about family values and how much she wanted to be a mother to Benjamin. He'd been so desperate to give his son a complete family again that he'd ignored the red flags. The way Benjamin got quiet whenever Camilla was around, the way the boy stopped talking about his mother, the way he started having nightmares and wetting the bed again at age 8. Richard had chalked it all up to adjustment, to grief, to normal kid stuff. But standing there at that altar, listening to that audio, he realized he'd been the biggest fool on Wall Street. The second audio started playing, and this one was even worse. "Your mama was a nobody, you hear me? A nobody from nowhere who got lucky marrying your daddy. But she's dead now, and I'm here, and you better get used to it, or I'll make your life a living hell." Camilla's voice dripped with contempt, the kind of pure meanness you'd expect from a villain in a Lifetime movie, not from a woman who'd just been about to say "I do" in front of God and 300 witnesses. The guests were in full shock mode now. Senator Williams from Connecticut, a man who'd seen his share of scandals in Washington, D.C., looked genuinely disturbed. Margaret Ashford, the society columnist for the New York Observer, was typing so fast on her phone, her fingers were a blur. And Father Murphy, who'd been performing weddings at St. Patrick's Cathedral for 30 years, had never seen anything like this in his entire career. He closed his Bible slowly, like he was closing the book on this whole disaster. Benjamin's voice, small but steady, cut through the chaos. "She said if I told anyone, she'd break my phone and say I was lying. She said nobody would believe a kid over a grown-up, especially not a pretty lady like her. The honesty in his voice was devastating. This wasn't a coached speech or a rehearsed performance. This was a child who'd been pushed to the absolute edge and decided that speaking up, even if it meant facing his worst fears, was better than staying silent one more day. The ballroom, which had been decorated to look like something out of a fairy tale with white roses and twinkling lights, now felt more like a courtroom. The jury was the 300 guests, and they'd already reached their verdict. Camilla was guilty, and everyone knew it. Even her own friends from the junior league back in Savannah were inching away from her like guilt was contagious. Lydia Martinez, the nanny who'd been with the Carter family since Benjamin was born, stood in the back of the room with tears streaming down her face. She'd known something was wrong, had seen the bruises Benjamin tried to hide, had heard him crying in his room at night when Richard was away on business trips to San Francisco or Seattle or Austin. But she'd been too scared to speak up, too worried about losing her job, too afraid that nobody would believe a housekeeper over a woman who looked like she'd stepped out of a Talbot's catalog. Now, watching Benjamin find his courage, she felt a mix of relief and shame. The boy had done what she couldn't. He'd spoken truth to power, and the power was crumbling right before everyone's eyes. She wanted to run up and hug him, to tell him how brave he was, but she stayed put, letting him have his moment, letting the world finally see what she'd known all along. The audio kept playing, each recording worse than the last. There was the one where Camilla threatened to throw away all of Benjamin's photos of his mother. There was the one where she told him he was damaged goods because of his grief. There was the one where she laughed, actually laughed, while describing how she'd locked him in the basement storage room for 3 hours because he'd accidentally spilled juice on her Hermes bag. Each revelation hit the crowd like a physical blow. These weren't the actions of a stressed-out stepmom having a bad day. This was systematic, calculated cruelty. This was abuse, plain and simple, the kind that leaves scars you can't see, but that last a lifetime. And it was all happening in a penthouse on Fifth Avenue, behind doors that cost more than most people's houses, proving once again that money can't buy decency and privilege doesn't equal character. Richard finally found his voice, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. "Benjamin, son, is this all true?" The question hung in the air like smoke. The boy looked at his father with eyes that had seen too much pain for someone so young, eyes that had cried themselves dry too many times, eyes that had given up hope of being rescued until this very moment. "Yes, Dad, every word. I recorded it because I knew nobody would believe me otherwise. I'm just a kid and she's good at pretending." The simplicity of that statement, "she's good at pretending," cut deeper than any fancy lawyer's argument could have. It was the truth, unvarnished and undeniable. Camilla had been pretending for 2 years, playing the role of loving stepmother in public while being a monster in private. And she'd almost gotten away with it, almost made it to "I do," almost locked herself into a prenuptial agreement that would have set her up for life. The ballroom erupted into chaos. People were shouting, crying, arguing, filming everything on their phones for Instagram and Facebook and whatever social media platform would get them the most likes. Camilla's carefully constructed world was collapsing faster than the stock market in 2008, and there wasn't a bailout big enough to save her reputation now. Her mother tried one last desperate move, standing up and pointing at Lydia. "That nanny put him up to this. She's always been jealous of my daughter." But the accusation fell flat. Nobody was buying it anymore. The evidence was too clear, the recordings too damning, the truth too obvious. Benjamin had pulled back the curtain on the wizard, and what everyone saw was just a cruel woman who'd been willing to torture a grieving child to get her hands on a billionaire's fortune. The wedding was over before it even began. and everyone in that room knew they'd just witnessed something they'd be talking about for the rest of their lives. The chaos in the ballroom reached a fever pitch when Benjamin, still clutching that iPhone like his life depended on it, looked straight at his father and said, "There's more, Dad, a lot more." Richard felt his stomach drop like he was on a roller coaster at Six Flags, that sick feeling when you realize the ride's about to get a whole lot worse before it gets better. The guests leaned forward in their seats, some standing up to get a better view, like they were watching the final episode of a Netflix series they'd been binge-watching for months. Camilla's face had gone from beauty queen confident to cornered animal desperate, her eyes darting around the room, looking for an escape route that didn't exist. Patricia Westbrook, her mama, was fanning herself with the wedding program like she was about to faint right there in the front row, her carefully applied makeup starting to run with sweat. This wasn't just a wedding anymore, this was a full-blown public execution, and the executioner was an 8-year-old boy with a smartphone and the courage of a lion. Benjamin scrolled through his phone with trembling fingers, and the next audio that played made even the hardest hearts in that room crack wide open. "I don't care if you're hungry, you little parasite. You think I'm gonna waste good food on you after the way you embarrassed me in front of the Vanderbilts at brunch?" Camilla's voice was ice cold, the kind of cold that comes from a heart that never learned how to love anything except money and status. The recording continued with the sound of a door slamming, a lock clicking, and then Benjamin's small voice crying, "Please, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to spill the orange juice." Nay, the timestamp showed it was from 3 months ago, on a Sunday afternoon when Richard had been playing golf at Winged Foot with clients from Boston. While he'd been closing deals and celebrating birdies, his son had been locked in his room, starving, begging for mercy from a woman who had none to give. The society ladies, who'd spent thousands on their dresses for this wedding, were openly crying now, mascara running down their cheeks like rivers of regret for every time they'd complimented Camilla on what a wonderful stepmother she seemed to be. Dr. James Whitmore, Richard's longtime friend and a child psychologist from Yale, stood up from his seat near the back and made his way toward the altar. He'd known Benjamin since the boy was born, had been there when Sarah died, had watched Richard struggle through grief and try to rebuild his life. "Richard, I need to see that phone," he said quietly, his professional demeanor barely masking the rage building inside him. Benjamin handed it over without hesitation, and Dr. Whitmore started scrolling through the recordings with the practiced eye of someone who'd seen too many cases of child abuse in his 30-year career. His face grew darker with each audio file, each video clip, each piece of evidence that painted a picture of systematic torture disguised as discipline. "There are 47 recordings here," he announced to the room, his voice shaking with controlled fury. 47 separate incidents of verbal abuse, threats, and psychological manipulation. This child has been documenting his own abuse because he knew that nobody would believe him without proof. The ballroom fell into a stunned silence, the kind of silence that feels heavier than sound, like the air itself was holding its breath. Senator Williams, who'd seen his share of scandals in Washington, but nothing quite like this, pulled out his own phone and started making calls to the district attorney, to Child Protective Services, to anyone who could make sure this didn't get swept under the rug like so many other crimes of the wealthy and powerful. Margaret Ashford, the Society columnist, had stopped taking notes for gossip and started taking notes for what she knew would be the most important article of her career. This wasn't just a story about a wedding gone wrong. This was a story about how easy it is for abuse to hide behind designer clothes and charity galas. How a child's cries for help can be drowned out by the clinking of champagne glasses and the chatter of people too busy networking to notice the suffering right in front of them. The Plaza Hotel, which had hosted countless fairy tale weddings over its 100-plus years of history, had never seen anything like this. and the staff members watching from the sidelines knew they'd be telling this story to their grandchildren someday. Camilla finally found her voice, though it came out as a desperate shriek that sounded nothing like the smooth southern drawl she'd been using for 2 years. "He's lying. Kids make things up all the time. Y'all know how dramatic children can be." But her protests sounded hollow, even to her own ears, especially when Dr. Whitmore held up the phone and said, "These recordings have metadata, dates, times, GPS locations. They were all made inside the Carter penthouse, most of them when Richard was documented to be out of town on business. There's no way a child could fabricate this level of detail." He turned to Richard, his old friend who looked like he'd aged 10 years in the last 10 minutes. "Richard, I'm legally obligated to report this. But more than that, as someone who's known your family for decades, I'm telling you right now, this boy saved his own life today. Kids who suffer this kind of abuse without intervention, the statistics aren't good. Benjamin is a survivor and he deserves every bit of protection and support we can give him." The crowd's mood shifted from shock to anger, the kind of righteous anger that makes people want to do something, to fix what's broken, to protect the innocent. Tom Davidson, Richard's business partner from Silicon Valley, walked up to Camilla and said in a voice loud enough for everyone to hear, "You're done, not just with this family, but with this whole social circle. By tomorrow morning, every country club from here to California will know exactly what kind of person you are." It wasn't a threat. It was a promise, and everyone in that room knew Tom had the connections to make it happen. Camilla's friends from Georgia, the ones who'd flown up for the wedding expecting a weekend of champagne and celebration, were already gathering their things and heading for the exits, not wanting to be associated with the scandal that was about to explode across every news outlet in America. Patricia Westbrook tried one more time to defend her daughter, standing up and shouting, "Y'all are making a mountain out of a molehill. Every parent disciplines their children." But her words were drowned out by a chorus of voices shouting back, "That's not discipline, that's abuse." Lydia, the nanny, finally found the courage to step forward. She'd been silent for too long, complicit in her silence even though she'd never raised a hand to Benjamin herself. "I saw things," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, but somehow carrying across the entire ballroom. "I saw the bruises he tried to hide. I heard him crying at night. I found him locked in the basement storage room twice, and both times Miss Camilla told me it was because he'd misbehaved and needed to learn a lesson." Her confession opened the floodgates. Other staff members started speaking up. The housekeeper, who'd been told to throw away Benjamin's drawings of his mother. The driver who'd noticed the boy flinching whenever Camilla raised her voice. The cook, who'd been instructed not to feed Benjamin dinner on multiple occasions as punishment for minor infractions. It was like a dam breaking, all these people who'd seen pieces of the truth, but never had the courage to speak up until now, until an 8-year-old boy showed them what real courage looked like. Richard Carter, the man who'd built an empire on being decisive and in control, felt completely powerless. He looked at his son, really looked at him for the first time in months, and saw the weight the boy had been carrying, the fear in his eyes, the tension in his small shoulders, the way he stood like he was always ready to run or defend himself. "Benjamin," Richard said, his voice breaking, "why didn't you tell me?" The question hung in the air, and Benjamin's answer was simple and devastating. "I tried, Dad. I tried so many times. But you were always busy, always on a call, always telling me to work it out with Camilla because you thought I just needed time to adjust. So I stopped trying to tell you with words, and I started collecting proof instead because I knew someday I'd need it." The honesty of that statement hit Richard harder than any business failure ever could. His son had been fighting a war alone, documenting his own abuse like a detective building a case, all because the one person who should have protected him had been too distracted by work and too blinded by loneliness to see what was happening in his own home. The recordings kept coming, each one more damning than the last. There was video footage too. Benjamin had propped his phone up on a bookshelf and recorded Camilla screaming at him for 20 minutes straight about how he was ruining her life and how she should have never agreed to deal with someone else's damaged kid. There was a recording of her on the phone with her mother, laughing about the prenuptial agreement and saying, "Once I'm legally his stepmother, we can ship the brat off to boarding school in Switzerland, and I'll have Richard all to myself and access to that beautiful fortune." The calculated nature of it all, the premeditation, the cold-blooded manipulation, it was all there, documented in high definition, impossible to deny or explain away. The guests who'd come expecting to celebrate love were instead witnessing the exposure of one of the most elaborate cons in New York society history, and they couldn't look away even though every new revelation made them feel sick to their stomachs. By the time the last recording finished playing, Camilla Westbrook's reputation was in ruins. Her mother was being escorted out by security, and Richard Carter was on his knees in front of his son, tears streaming down his face, begging for forgiveness he wasn't sure he deserved. The wedding that was supposed to unite two people had instead revealed a truth that would tear one woman's lies apart and give a little boy his voice back. Benjamin stood there, exhausted but unbowed. Having done what no adult in his life had been brave enough to do, he'd spoken up, he'd fought back, and he'd won. The ballroom at the Plaza Hotel, which had seen countless celebrations over the decades, had never witnessed anything quite like this. A child's courage, changing the course of multiple lives in real time, proving that sometimes the smallest voice in the room is the one that matters most. And as the chaos continued to swirl around him, Benjamin felt something he hadn't felt in 2 years: hope. The atmosphere in the ballroom had shifted from shock to something darker, something that felt like justice waiting to be served. Robert Mitchell, the family attorney who'd flown in from Boston specifically for this wedding, pushed his way through the crowd with the determination of a man who'd seen enough courtroom drama to know when a case was open and shut. He was a Harvard law graduate, 62 years old, with silver hair and a reputation for being tougher than a $2 steak. And right now, his face was red with barely contained fury. "Richard, I need that phone immediately," he said, not asking but demanding. "We're looking at criminal charges here: child endangerment, emotional abuse, false imprisonment. This isn't just a family matter anymore. This is a legal matter. And I need to secure that evidence before anyone tries to claim it's been tampered with." Dr. Whitmore handed over the iPhone carefully, like it was a piece of evidence at a crime scene, which in many ways it was. Mitchell pulled out his own phone and started making calls to his paralegal back in Boston, to a forensic tech expert he knew in Manhattan, to anyone who could help build an airtight case that would make sure Camilla Westbrook never got near another child again. Camilla, realizing that her carefully constructed world was collapsing faster than the Twin Towers on 9/11, made one last, desperate play. She dropped to her knees right there on the altar, her $20,000 Vera Wang dress pooling around her like a white puddle of lies, and started sobbing, big theatrical sobs that would have won her an Oscar if this were a movie instead of real life. "I'm sorry, I'm so sorry. I was under so much pressure trying to be a good mother, trying to live up to Sarah's memory, trying to make everyone happy." Her southern accent got thicker with every word, like she thought playing up the Belle in Distress routine would somehow make people forget the recordings they'd just heard. But the crowd wasn't buying it, not for a second. These were New Yorkers, people who'd seen every con game in the book, and they could smell fake remorse from a mile away. Senator Williams actually laughed, a short, bitter bark of a laugh, and said loud enough for half the room to hear, "Save it for the judge, sweetheart. You're gonna need a better performance than that." Patricia Westbrook, Camilla's mother, wasn't ready to give up the fight. She stood up, all 5'2" of her, dressed in her finest clothes from Neiman Marcus, and pointed a perfectly manicured finger at Benjamin. "That boy has always been troubled. Ever since his mama died, he's been making up stories for attention. My daughter tried her best with him, but some children are just born bad." The accusation was so outrageous, so completely tone-deaf, given everything that had just been revealed, that several people in the crowd actually gasped. Margaret Ashford, the Society columnist, stopped typing on her phone long enough to say, "Ma'am, with all due respect, we just listened to 47 recordings of your daughter psychologically torturing a child. The only person who's bad here is sitting right next to you." But Patricia wasn't done. She'd spent her whole life climbing the social ladder in Charleston, had raised Camilla to marry rich and marry well, and she wasn't about to let some ungrateful brat ruin years of careful planning. "Y'all don't understand. In the South, we believe in discipline. We believe in teaching children respect." That's when Lydia, the nanny who'd been silent for too long, finally snapped. She'd been raised in the Bronx, had worked for wealthy families for 20 years, and had seen enough to know the difference between discipline and abuse. "Respect?" she said, her voice rising with each word. "You call locking a child in a dark basement for hours respect? You call starving him, threatening him, destroying his memories of his dead mother respect? I've worked for a lot of families, rich and poor, and I've never seen anything as cruel as what your daughter did to that boy." Her hands were shaking, her voice was shaking, but she kept going. "I should have spoken up sooner. I should have called the police, called child services, called somebody. But I was scared of losing my job, scared of not being believed, scared of going up against people with money and power. But Benjamin wasn't scared. An 8-year-old child had more courage than all of us adults combined, and that's something I'm going to have to live with for the rest of my life." By the time she finished, there wasn't a dry eye in the house, and Patricia Westbrook had shrunk back into her seat, finally realizing she'd lost this battle. Robert Mitchell, the attorney, finished his phone calls and turned to address the room like he was giving a closing argument to a jury. "Ladies and gentlemen, I want to make something very clear. What we've witnessed here today isn't just a family dispute or a wedding gone wrong. This is documented evidence of systematic child abuse. The recordings on this phone show a pattern of behavior that meets the legal definition of emotional abuse, psychological manipulation, and false imprisonment." He held up the iPhone like it was Exhibit A in a trial. "The metadata on these files has been verified by my tech expert. The dates, times, and locations all match up with Richard's travel schedule, which we have documented through his calendar and credit card receipts. There is no question about the authenticity of this evidence. None." He paused, letting that sink in, then continued. "I've already contacted the Manhattan District Attorney's office. They're sending someone over right now. Miss Westbrook, I strongly suggest you retain legal counsel because you're going to need it." The finality in his voice left no room for argument, and Camilla's sobs got louder. Though whether they were from genuine remorse or fear of consequences, nobody could tell and nobody really cared. Tom Davidson, Richard's business partner and a man who'd made his fortune in Silicon Valley by being able to read people like code, walked over to where Camilla was still kneeling on the floor. "You know what the really sick part is?" he said, his voice quiet but carrying across the silent ballroom. "You almost got away with it. You played the part so well. The grieving widow helping a lonely widower, the patient stepmother dealing with a difficult child, the Southern belle bringing warmth to a cold New York penthouse. You had us all fooled. Hell, I was the one who introduced you to Richard at that charity gala in the Hamptons, and I thought I was doing him a favor." He shook his head, disgusted with himself as much as with her. But you got greedy. You couldn't just be content with the lifestyle, with the penthouse, with the credit cards and the country club memberships. You had to torture a grieving child, had to try to erase his mother's memory, had to make his life hell just because he was in the way of your perfect plan. And that's what's going to send you to prison, not the con, but the cruelty. The crowd started to murmur, people processing everything they'd heard and seen, trying to reconcile the woman they thought they knew with the monster who'd been exposed. Jennifer Morrison, a friend of Richard's late wife, Sarah, stood up and addressed the room. I want everyone here to remember something. Sarah Carter was one of the kindest, most loving people I've ever known. She died in a car accident on the 405 in Los Angeles 3 years ago, and it devastated Richard and Benjamin. They were lost, grieving, vulnerable. Her voice cracked with emotion. And this woman, she pointed at Camilla, saw that vulnerability and exploited it. She didn't come into their lives to help them heal. She came to take what she could get, and she was willing to destroy a child to do it. Sarah would be heartbroken to know what her son went through, but she'd also be so proud of his courage today. The mention of Sarah's name seemed to break something in Richard, and he pulled Benjamin into a tight hug, finally, being the father the boy had needed all along. Camilla, seeing that her tears weren't working and her mother's arguments had failed, tried one last desperate tactic. She stood up, wiped her eyes, and her whole demeanor changed. The Southern Belle Act dropped away, and what was left was cold, calculating, and mean as a snake. Fine. You want the truth? I'll give you the truth. Her voice had lost all its sweetness, replaced by a hard edge that sounded more Brooklyn than Georgia. I tolerated that kid because of the prenup. That's it. Richard's lawyer made it clear that if I wanted access to the real money, I had to play stepmom for at least 5 years. 5 years of dealing with a whiny, needy brat who couldn't stop crying about his dead mommy. 5 years of pretending to care about his stupid drawings and his boring stories and his constant need for attention. She laughed, a harsh sound that made people flinch. You think I wanted to be a mother? I wanted to be a billionaire's wife. I wanted the penthouse, the vacation homes, the private jets. The kid was just an obstacle, and I dealt with him the best way I knew how, by making sure he stayed out of my way. The confession hit the room like a bomb. Even people who'd already been convinced of Camilla's guilt were shocked by the casual cruelty of her words, the complete lack of remorse, the cold-blooded admission that she'd tortured a child for money. Robert Mitchell was already recording the confession on his phone, making sure every word was documented. Senator Williams had his phone out too, as did half the guests in the room. Camilla had just confessed to child abuse in front of 300 witnesses, and every word of it was being captured for posterity and for the prosecutors who were on their way. Patricia Westbrook tried to stop her daughter. "Camilla, shut up, don't say another word." But it was too late. The mask had come off completely, and what everyone saw underneath was exactly what Benjamin had been trying to tell them all along. A woman with no heart, no conscience, and no business being anywhere near a child. The fairy tale was over, and the villain had finally been exposed for exactly what she was. Richard Carter, still holding his son, looked at the woman he'd almost married and felt nothing but disgust and shame. Disgust for her, and shame for himself for being so blind. "Get out," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "Get out of this hotel, get out of my life, and if you ever come near my son again, I will use every resource I have to make sure you spend the rest of your life in prison." It wasn't a threat made in anger. It was a promise made with the cold certainty of a man who'd finally woken up and realized what he'd almost lost. Camilla opened her mouth to respond, but Tom Davidson cut her off. "You heard the man. Security's waiting to escort you out. And trust me, by tomorrow morning, every news outlet from CNN to Fox News is going to be running this story. You wanted to be famous? Congratulations, you're about to be the most hated woman in America. 2 security guards appeared as if on cue, and Camilla Westbrook, former Miss Georgia and almost Mrs. Richard Carter, was escorted out of the Plaza Hotel ballroom in disgrace, her white dress trailing behind her like a surrender flag, her dreams of wealth and status shattered beyond repair, leaving behind nothing but the wreckage of her lies and the beginning of justice for a little boy who'd been brave enough to speak his truth. 6 months had passed since that unforgettable day at the Plaza Hotel, and the Carter penthouse on Fifth Avenue looked completely different now. Gone were the cold, sterile decorations that Camilla had insisted on, the all-white furniture that nobody was allowed to sit on, the expensive art that was more about showing off than actual beauty, the fake flowers that cost a fortune but had no life in them. In their place were family photos covering every surface, including a whole wall dedicated to Sarah Carter, Benjamin's mother, with pictures from her college days at UCLA, her wedding day, holding baby Benjamin at the hospital, and candid shots of her laughing that made the whole room feel warmer. Richard had hired an interior designer from Brooklyn, a woman named Rosa, who understood that homes should feel lived in, not like museum exhibits. And she'd transformed the penthouse into a real home where a kid could actually be a kid. There were art supplies scattered on the coffee table, a basketball hoop on Benjamin's bedroom door, and the kitchen smelled like actual cooking instead of catered meals from fancy restaurants that nobody really enjoyed. Benjamin was thriving in ways that seemed almost miraculous to everyone who'd known him during the dark days with Camilla. He'd started therapy twice a week with Dr. Whitmore, working through the trauma and learning that what happened to him wasn't his fault, that speaking up was the bravest thing he could have done, and that healing takes time, but it does happen. His nightmares had decreased from every night to maybe once a week, and when they did happen, Richard was right there. Not on a business call in another room, but sitting on the edge of Benjamin's bed, holding his hand, reminding him that he was safe now and always would be. The boy had rejoined his soccer team at the private school on the Upper East Side, and his coach said he'd never seen a kid play with so much heart and determination. Benjamin had even made new friends, real friends who came over for sleepovers and video games, and the kind of normal childhood chaos that Richard now welcomed instead of trying to schedule and control. The smile on his son's face, genuine and frequent now, was worth more to Richard than every dollar in his bank account. Lydia Martinez had become an official part of the family, not just as a nanny, but as someone Richard trusted completely with his son's well-being and happiness. He'd given her a substantial raise, better benefits, and most importantly, his word that her voice would always be heard and respected in that household. She'd been the one to suggest family dinners every night, no phones allowed, just conversation and connection, and those dinners had become the highlight of Benjamin's day. They'd talk about school, about current events, about silly things like whether hot dogs were sandwiches, or what superpower would be the most useful in New York City. Lydia taught Benjamin how to cook simple meals, scrambled eggs, grilled cheese, spaghetti with marinara sauce, giving him skills and confidence in the kitchen. She also made sure that Sarah's memory stayed alive in healthy ways, sharing stories about Benjamin's mother that Richard had been too grief-stricken to talk about before, helping the boy understand that loving and remembering someone who's gone isn't the same as being stuck in the past. The three of them had become a team, a real family unit built on trust and communication instead of fear and secrets. The legal consequences for Camilla Westbrook had been swift and severe, exactly as Robert Mitchell had promised. The Manhattan District Attorney's Office had pursued charges of child endangerment, emotional abuse, and false imprisonment, and with 47 recordings plus testimony from Lydia and other household staff, the case was airtight. Camilla had tried to fight it at first, hiring an expensive lawyer from a white shoe firm in Midtown, but even he couldn't overcome the mountain of evidence against her. She'd eventually taken a plea deal, 3 years in a minimum security facility upstate, 5 years probation after that, and a permanent restraining order keeping her at least 500 feet away from Benjamin Carter for the rest of her life. Patricia Westbrook, her mother, had slunk back to Charleston in disgrace, her social standing in tatters after the story went national on CNN, Fox News, and every major newspaper from the New York Times to the Washington Post. The Junior League had quietly asked her to resign. The country club had revoked her membership, and the society friends who'd once competed for invitations to her garden parties now crossed the street to avoid her. Justice, it seemed, had been served both in the courtroom and in the court of public opinion. Richard Carter had made major changes in his own life, realizing that all the money in the world meant nothing if he wasn't present for his son. He'd stepped back from day-to-day operations at his tech company, promoting Tom Davidson to CEO and taking on a chairman role that required far less travel and far fewer 18-hour workdays. His business partners had been surprisingly supportive, especially after the story broke, and they realized how close Richard had come to losing everything that actually mattered. He'd started attending Benjamin's soccer games, school plays, and parent-teacher conferences, things he'd always been too busy for before. He'd also joined a grief support group in Manhattan, finally processing Sarah's death in a healthy way, instead of trying to bury the pain under work and then under a disastrous relationship with Camilla. The group met every Thursday evening at a community center in Chelsea, and Richard found comfort in talking with other widows and widowers who understood the unique pain of losing a spouse and trying to raise kids alone. It was humbling, sitting in a circle of folding chairs with people from all walks of life, but it was also healing in ways his expensive therapist's office had never been. The media attention had been intense for the first few months, with reporters camping outside the building and trying to get interviews with anyone connected to the story. Margaret Ashford's article in the New York Observer had gone viral, spawning think pieces about child abuse in wealthy families, the dangers of prioritizing appearances over well-being, and the courage it takes for children to speak up against adults. Benjamin's identity had been protected. The media referred to him only as the brave boy or the young hero. But his story had resonated with people across the country. Child abuse hotlines reported a significant increase in calls, with many children saying they'd been inspired by Benjamin's courage to report their own situations. Schools started implementing new programs to teach kids about recognizing abuse and speaking up safely. The story had become bigger than just one family scandal. It had become a catalyst for change, proof that even the smallest voice can make the biggest difference when it speaks truth to power. Richard received hundreds of letters from parents thanking him for taking his son's allegations seriously, from abuse survivors sharing their own stories, and from people who'd been moved by Benjamin's bravery. About 4 months after the wedding disaster, something unexpected happened. Richard and Lydia were cleaning up after dinner one evening. Benjamin was upstairs doing homework, and they started talking, really talking about life, about loss, about second chances. Lydia shared stories about growing up in the Bronx with immigrant parents who'd worked 3 jobs to give her opportunities, about her own failed marriage years ago, about why she dedicated her life to caring for other people's children. Richard opened up about his guilt over Sarah's death. He'd been the one driving that day in Los Angeles, and even though the accident was caused by a drunk driver running a red light, he'd never forgiven himself for not being able to protect her. They talked until midnight, sitting at the kitchen table with cold coffee, and somewhere in that conversation, Richard realized he was falling for this woman who'd shown his son more genuine love and care than Camilla ever had. It wasn't the whirlwind romance he'd had with Camilla, all champagne and charity galas and surface-level attraction. This was something deeper, built on shared values, mutual respect, and a genuine partnership in raising Benjamin. It scared him at first, the idea of opening his heart again after being so spectacularly wrong about Camilla. But Lydia was patient, understanding, and honest in ways that made him feel safe. They took things slow, dating for months before even telling Benjamin, wanting to make sure this was real and lasting before involving him in another potential change. They went to diners in Queens, walked through Central Park on Sunday mornings, caught Broadway shows from the cheap seats, and talked about everything from politics to their favorite childhood memories. Lydia insisted on paying for half of everything, refusing to let Richard's wealth change the dynamic between them, and he respected her for it. When they finally told Benjamin about their relationship, sitting him down for a family meeting that Richard was more nervous about than any board presentation he'd ever given, the boy's reaction surprised them both. "I already knew," Benjamin said with a grin. "You guys smile at each other all the time. And Lydia, you make my dad laugh, like really laugh, the way he used to with Mom. I think Mom would be happy that he found someone good." And the simple wisdom of that statement, the generosity of spirit from a kid who'd been through so much, made both adults tear up. They'd been so worried about Benjamin's reaction, but he'd already figured it out and given them his blessing in his own way. A year and a half after that fateful day at the plaza, Richard proposed to Lydia in the most un-billionaire way possible, at Coney Island, on the beach at sunset, with Benjamin hiding behind a hot dog stand, filming the whole thing on his phone. There was no fancy restaurant, no string quartet, no photographer staging perfect shots, just Richard, down on one knee in the sand, holding a ring he'd chosen himself instead of sending an assistant to Tiffany's, asking Lydia Martinez if she'd do him the honor of becoming his wife and officially becoming Benjamin's mother. She said yes through happy tears, and Benjamin came running out from his hiding spot to hug them both, and random people on the beach started clapping and cheering even though they had no idea who these people were. They got married 3 months later in a small ceremony at a church in Brooklyn, Lydia's childhood parish, with about 50 guests, real friends and family, not business contacts or social climbers. Benjamin walked Lydia down the aisle, and when the priest asked if anyone objected, the boy stood up and said, "I object to anyone ever hurting my family again, but I'm totally for this wedding." The whole church laughed, and there wasn't a dry eye in the place. The reception was at an Italian restaurant in the neighborhood, with too much food, too much wine, too much laughter, and exactly the right amount of love. The transformation in all their lives was remarkable, the kind of change that makes you believe in second chances and the resilience of the human spirit. Benjamin, now 10 years old, was a confident, happy kid who still had moments of struggle. Trauma doesn't just disappear, but who knew he was loved, protected, and heard? He'd started speaking at schools and youth groups about his experience, with his therapist's guidance and his parents' support, helping other kids understand that abuse is never okay, and that speaking up is always the right choice, even when it's scary. Richard had found balance in his life, success that was measured not in stock prices but in soccer games attended and bedtime stories read and family vacations to places like Disney World and the Grand Canyon. Lydia had gone from being just the nanny to being the heart of a family, proving that love isn't about blood or money, but about showing up every day and choosing each other over and over again. The penthouse on Fifth Avenue, once a showplace for Camilla's ambitions, had become a real home, filled with laughter, arguments, forgiveness, growth, and the messy, beautiful reality of a family that had been broken but chose to heal together. And every night, before bed, the three of them would gather in front of Sarah's photo wall, and Benjamin would say goodnight to his first mom while holding hands with his dad and his second mom, proof that love doesn't divide, it multiplies, and that the human heart has infinite capacity for healing when given the chance. Looking back at everything Benjamin Carter went through, from those dark days of suffering in silence to standing up at that altar in the Plaza Hotel, it's impossible not to think about how many kids out there are going through something similar right now in penthouses and trailer parks, in suburbs and cities, behind closed doors where nobody's watching. The truth is, abuse doesn't have a zip code, doesn't care about your bank account, and doesn't discriminate based on what neighborhood you live in. Benjamin's story shook New York society to its core, but more importantly, it reminded all of us that children deserve to be believed, protected, and loved unconditionally, not treated like obstacles or bargaining chips in adult games. How many times have we, as parents, as neighbors, as friends, been too busy or too uncomfortable to ask the hard questions when we notice something's off with a child? How many Benjamins are out there right now, recording their own abuse on smartphones, building cases against the very people who should be protecting them, waiting for just one adult to care enough to listen? The courage it took for that 8-year-old boy to stand up in front of 300 people and expose his abuser should inspire every single one of us to be more vigilant, more compassionate, and more willing to act when we see something wrong, because silence protects abusers and speaking up saves lives. Richard Carter's journey from blind, workaholic father to present, engaged parent is a reminder that it's never too late to change, to admit you were wrong, to do better. He'd built an empire worth billions, but almost lost the only thing that truly mattered: his son's well-being and trust. His story resonates especially with those of us who've gotten caught up in careers, in appearances, in trying to maintain some perfect image while the people we love most are crying out for our attention. The second chance he got with Benjamin, and later with Lydia, didn't come easy. It came through hard work, therapy, humility, and a willingness to completely restructure his priorities and his life. That's the kind of redemption that matters, not the Hollywood version where everything's fixed with one tearful conversation, but the real-life version where healing takes time, where trust has to be rebuilt brick by brick, where showing up every single day matters more than grand gestures. And for those of us watching this story, whether we're parents or grandparents or aunts and uncles or teachers or neighbors, the question becomes, what are we willing to change in our own lives to make sure the children around us feel safe, heard, and valued? If Benjamin's courage moved you, if this story made you think differently about the kids in your own life, then don't just sit there, do something about it. Subscribe to Journeys of Redemption right now, hit that like button, and share this video with everyone you know, because stories like this need to be told and retold until every child knows they have the right to speak up and every adult knows they have the responsibility to listen. Drop a comment telling me what city and state you're watching from. I want to know how far across America this message is reaching. From the beaches of California, to the mountains of Colorado, to the streets of New York. And listen, there's another powerful story waiting for you right now, appearing on your screen, about courage, redemption, and the strength of the human spirit. Click on it, keep this journey going, because every story we share, every conversation we start, every mind we change, brings us one step closer to a world where no child has to suffer in silence. Thank you for watching until the very end, for caring enough to hear Benjamin's story, and for being the kind of person who believes that truth and justice still matter in this world. Until the next video, remember, your voice matters, your actions matter, and sometimes the bravest thing you can do is simply refuse to look away when someone needs help. See you next time.